Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, breaking alts. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We, of course, do have several different tiers available. Links in the description below. Make sure you check it out. Let's go ahead and jump in. Given the title, Breaking Alts, I figured it would only be necessary to color code the dominance candles blue. So we have dark blue and light blue for the Bitcoin dominance candles. Now, the reason we're calling this Breaking Alts is because I think Bitcoin is in the process of breaking the altcoin market, at least temporarily. I do think the altcoin market will come back, but I also think this is a fairly necessary component of the market cycle. It has played out in the past, and I think it's about to play out once again. Now, the idea here is if we rewind the clock back, one of the things we said back in February of 2022 is in the video, the navigating the bear market video, we said alts are risky. And I said back then that the altcoin market is too risky. I said if you want to buy an altcoin, it's probably better to take a cold shower and reconsider, and so on and so forth. Right? The altcoin market is likely going to go down. Now, with that in mind, a lot of people might look at that and say, well, had I sat out of the altcoin market, they wouldn't have seen all these rallies, right? All the rallies that the altcoin market saw of 40%, 50%, etc. Or here's another 40% rally by the altcoin market. This one right here is another 40% rally by the altcoin market. Or so missed out on some of these rallies. And the point is it doesn't really matter because most of them have been bleeding on their Bitcoin pairs. Now there have been a few that outperformed, but most of them have been bleeding on their Bitcoin pairs. Now again, none of this is financial advice. I just want to try to convey my opinion here. One of the things to consider with regards to the altcoin market is that it has continued to bleed back to Bitcoin for a long time. Now, the Bitcoin dominance videos that I do can often be met with criticism. Some of it I think is warranted, but using the Bitcoin dominance, including stablecoins, as justification for the idea that most of the altcoin market has not been bleeding back to Bitcoin is just simply not true, right? It has been going on. If you look at the dominance excluding stables, so again, excluding the stablecoin market, it's actually been putting in higher lows since May of 2021 and really been putting in higher lows since January of 2018. Also been putting in lower highs. But again, since May of 2021, which is when I really first became bullish on the dominance, you can see that excluding stables, it has in fact been putting in higher lows. And if you take a moving average of this, you can see that it's been building out a fairly large base for what I think is going to be a continued and explosive move higher by the dominance of Bitcoin. Now, what I want to do is I want to compare the dominance rally to the context of the past. All right. Now, is there anything special about this Bitcoin dominance rally? Not yet, but I think it will break out. Admittedly, I thought it was going to break out in June of 2022. I thought that was the breakout. Okay, so it's possible that I think it again and it doesn't happen. But I want to draw your attention to one very specific thing. If you look at the dominance of Bitcoin back in 2018, what you'll notice is that it rallied from around that 39% level. Okay, so we've seen a very similar move by Bitcoin dominance here, right? It moved from this 39% level all the way up to around 48%. Now it's moving from that level again, 39% or so, and we find ourselves approaching that 48% threshold. Now, one of the things to consider is that the dominance here, when it rallied from 39%, it went all the way up to 62%. Now, oftentimes when you think about the Bitcoin dominance, you might assume that if the dominance is going up, Bitcoin USD is only going in one direction for the duration of that move higher in the Bitcoin dominance. This is often a common assumption, although history shows us that's not necessarily a valid assumption. If you were to overlay Bitcoin USD on this chart, let's switch this over to a logarithmic scale. What you'll notice here, and let me change this to a different color so it shows up a little bit better. If you draw a line through this rally by Bitcoin USD when it rallied from 6K all the way up to around 8K, you'll notice that during that rally, the Bitcoin dominance was going up. But also during that rally, at the end of the rally, the dominance continued to go up, even after Bitcoin came back down to a slightly higher low. Now, let's write this out for a minute here. So what do you notice? So in 2018, Bitcoin USD was going up. And while Bitcoin USD was going up, the dominance rallied from all the way down here, at 39 to 40% or so, all the way up to, and I mean, part of that, it did go down here initially, but it went up and it continued to go up all the way to about the time the dominance hit around 50%. So Bitcoin USD, let's say 39% dominance up to around 50% dominance during that move, okay? Then Bitcoin USD came down and then put in a lower high. And during that move, right, so Bitcoin USD went down, the dominance went from 50% to 62%. So the first half of the move occurred when Bitcoin USD was in this crazy rally. The second half occurred when Bitcoin came back down to earth. But what's the important distinction in this rally by the dominance? It took out the prior high, okay? So the rally by Bitcoin USD allowed for the dominance to take out the prior high. The point of that is that it gets altcoins off of their Bitcoin support levels. And so that when Bitcoin USD corrects, the altcoin market has nowhere to hide because they've fallen off of their Bitcoin support levels. And we're going to go through a lot of those later on in the video. But you can see that the dominance made it to a level higher than where it was at the prior top. And so when Bitcoin corrected, all the altcoins were already shaken off their Bitcoin pairs, and therefore they continued to go down on their Bitcoin pairs and while Bitcoin USD went down. What do you notice this time? The highest rally that the dominance had was back over here, and the dominance did not make it there, right? It came very close, but it did not quite make it there. And it also occurred when Bitcoin USD was going down. Now Bitcoin USD is going up, and the dominance is trying to get to this level. Now, what is that magical line in the sand? It's around a dominance of 49%. So what I think you need to see, or what I'd like to see, is I'd like to see Bitcoin dominance break the prior high of around 49%. So if it can get to that 49 to 50% level, then you could argue that it's broken the altcoin market, okay? And that means if Bitcoin comes back down, then the altcoin market might not rally. Now, why is that important? There's this common assumption that after Bitcoin USD goes parabolic, that the altcoin market will. Okay, a lot of people assume that. And why shouldn't they? They saw it happen in 2021. They saw it happen in 2017. But what you might not be aware of is that there was a rally by Bitcoin USD in 2018, and there was a rally over here in 2019. And after both rallies, when Bitcoin USD came back down, the dominance continued higher. After both rallies, the dominance continued higher. Okay? So then the argument, of course, is, well, if the dominance can go higher when Bitcoin USD comes down, then that means the altcoins are going to likely bleed quite a bit on their USD pairs, because what we've seen time and time again over the last several months is that Bitcoin has just been outperforming the altcoin market as a whole. Now, there are always a few altcoins that outperform. I'm not trying to take anything away from that. I don't know which ones there's going to be, and I'm not going to pretend like I know. So it's better for me to just, make my crypto portfolio more focused on Bitcoin than the altcoin market, especially at phases like this. So some people say, well, how high can Bitcoin USD go? Well, you shouldn't really ask me. I don't know how high it's going to go here in the short term. But what I would say is that I hope it gets to a level soon, within the next week or two, so that it can get above the prior level of 49%. which is only a couple of percent higher really than where it is right now. So if the dominance can break above 49%, then I think you could argue that Bitcoin has now broken the altcoin market. And that means that if Bitcoin USD comes back down and people think, okay, well, the Bitcoin rally is over, therefore it's going to be time to sort of flow back into alts, that could be a poor decision if history is any indication, if this is the phase of breaking the altcoin market. Now, again, I could be wrong. I want to reiterate that, and this is not financial advice, but I just want people to understand that there is a risk that just because Bitcoin has gone parabolic recently, like it has in prior instances, even in 2019, you could argue that, after Bitcoin USD was done rallying right here, the dominance still continued higher into September, but Bitcoin USD topped in June and July, kind of like a double top sort of thing. So I think you have to at least consider that risk as we continue forward, is that if the dominance can go above that 49%, then when Bitcoin USD comes back down, I think you could argue that the dominance could continue higher and lead to the continuation of the altcoin reckoning. All right, we've talked about this quite a bit. Now, how high could Bitcoin go? Right now it's at 27K. If you think about it, last week, Bitcoin dominance opened up this week, 43.63%. Now it's at 46.76%. So it's moved up 3% in a week. If it were to move up 2.5%, it would take out this prior high. Okay, so it doesn't even need to repeat what it did last week to the same level. Like, it just needs to do a fraction of it, and it could take out the prior high. So my hope is that wherever it goes, it's enough to take out that level here, so that if it rallies on up here, gets above it, then when Bitcoin USD corrects, you see the dominance continue to go higher. This is the argument that I'm trying to sort of make clear, okay? Now, again, you could say, well, why compare it to 2018? Why not compare it to 2019? Cyclically, it might make more sense to compare it to 2019, but even in that case, again, the dominance continued higher even after Bitcoin started to correct. Now, it didn't continue to go higher forever, but it was a couple more months. So I think that's sort of the two main things you can look at are sort of this move here and this move here. This move here because it's sort of like a cyclically more comparable time. This move here because that's where the dominance has rallied from. So, the dominance rallied from that 39% level, very similar as to this phase rather than this phase. Because by this phase, the dominance was already at 52%, right? Now, the counterpoint to that, of course, is that, well, if you exclude stablecoins, the dominance right now is just below 52%. But again, this is also after a fairly impressive rally from 45% just a few weeks ago. So it's not like this move is starting at that level. But this is the point: is that the altcoin market can bleed against Bitcoin for far longer than most people expect. Okay, so let's suppose you're in, I think most people are going to be in one of two camps, right? You're in the camp that Bitcoin bottom is in, or you're in the camp that it's not in, right? You're in one of those two camps, or I guess you're in the camp that you don't care, right? Some people don't really care. But let's suppose you're in the camp that the bottom is in, okay? If you're in that camp, that doesn't necessarily, and I'm going to switch this back to some candles that maybe are going to be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing for people to look at for a long period of time. But if you're in the camp here that that the dominance, or sorry, if you're in the camp that the low is in, so what? Okay, why do I say that? Well, the low was in back in for Bitcoin in December 2018. It didn't stop some altcoins from going lower. It didn't stop ADA from going lower. It didn't stop XRP, another coin, from going lower. It didn't stop Dogecoin from going lower all the way out until 2020, and even putting in sort of a double bottom in 2019 and then going lower in 2020, right? So just because you might be in the camp that the bottom is in, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's in for the altcoin market, okay? So you have to consider that. So what would that look like? Well, I suppose that the more optimistic scenario would be that if this is sort of like a deviation to the downside, maybe you sort of see like this deviation to the upside for a while. it stays around here and then comes back in, puts in a higher low, and then rallies on up, right? That would sort of be the more optimistic scenario. And you might say, well, how is that the more optimistic scenario? This is more what I would consider realistic. I mean, even in 2015, you had two sort of false breakouts. In 2019, we ended up coming back into a slightly higher low. So I don't see why we should assume that this time is going to be any different in that regard. I know there are some theories out there popular or going around that we're going to have hyperinflation and this sort of stuff, and that it's going to lead to the rapid price movement of Bitcoin USD to the upside. But I think what's more likely than than hyperinflation would actually be rapid disinflation via a recession. I think that's more likely scenario based on a lot of the forward indicators that you can look at with regards to the macro, where we sit with the macro side of things. So I think that part's not going to be very much different in that regard. And if you're in the camp that the bottom is not in, then the altcoin market still makes even less sense. Okay? It makes even less sense. Now, if you remember back in June of 2022, there were a lot of people that thought that was the bottom. And I was clear. I said, I don't think it's the bottom. They thought it was the bottom back in Q3 of 2018 as well. And they were wrong. And the reason why I know they were wrong is because I was one of them back over here thinking this was the bottom, and it wasn't the bottom. And we ended up falling out. So when we were sort of putting in these same higher lows over here, I said, look, guys, I don't think this is the bottom because it's likely just going to play out the same way. And it did to some degree, but it didn't capitulate nearly as much. So I'm in the camp that it could be the bottom. And I said that back over here, that the next low could be the bottom. But the reality of the situation is that given the likelihood of recession, we still have to consider the possibility of a lower low, right? We have to consider that as a possibility because of a potential recession. Now, the reason there could be a potential recession is because of the aggressive tightening by the Federal Reserve. And there are certainly warning signs there. Okay, if you go take a look at the macroverse, and we go take a look at the yield curve, you'll notice that when it's inverted like this, like it was before the recession back in the financial crisis and before the dot-com recession, it looks pretty similar to how it does today. If you look at Treasury yield spreads, the 2-year, the 3-month and the 10-year are deeply inverted. The 2-year and the 10-year are deeply inverted. Normally, this precedes a recession. Now, a common mistake I've seen occur over the last year is that people say, well, we're already in a recession because of all these different factors. And I think you have to consider that, look, normally when the yield curve's inverted, we're not in a recession. It's after the uninversion of the yield curve that we go into a recession. So I think a lot of recession calls have been somewhat premature, but it doesn't mean that one's not coming. And if one comes, then that means liquidity is likely going to dry up even further, and that could be ultimately what leads you to lower prices. So I think when you look at Bitcoin USD, if you're in the camp that Bitcoin USD is bottomed, then altcoins can still bleed. And if you're in the camp that Bitcoin USD is not bottomed, then altcoins can certainly bleed back to Bitcoin. Now, how does the altcoin reckoning take place? Because we've been talking about it for a while. On any given day, someone might look at an altcoin and say, well, it's up today, or this altcoin's in an uptrend. But most altcoins have continued to eventually push lower, okay? Now, let me draw your attention to a couple of important details. If you look at Bitcoin USD, what you'll notice is that it has already broken out of this downtrend line, right? It already broke out and it retested it, and it's popped back up. Now, the total 3, the altcoin market, so total 3 is everything besides Bitcoin and Ethereum. Total 3 has not broken out, which is interesting. What does that show you? It shows you that there's a relative weakness in the altcoin market that is compared to Bitcoin, right? A relative weakness here. Bitcoin is broken out, but the altcoin market has not. So what happens if Bitcoin breaks down before total 3 breaks out? What happens if that occurs? Well, the same thing that happened over here, right? If you connect the dots. Same thing, right? What did we have happen over here? You had total 3 sort of bounce here, off of it again, off of it here. We had sort of a false breakout and then a final plunge. this move down by total 3 from the top was over 60%, 61% to the downside. Quite an impressive move to the downside. Now, what does that look like over here? Well, the top part of this channel right here is just over 400 billion. So you could say like 410 billion. Now remember, this one over here did have sort of like a false breakout. So perhaps it could go slightly above 410. Maybe it goes to 420 billion or 430 billion. But the point is, look, what happens if Bitcoin breaks down here? Sorry. What happens if Bitcoin breaks down here before total 3 has broken out? Well, it means that there's nowhere to hide for the altcoin market. Okay, it can easily come back in. It doesn't have this level to hold support on if it can't even break out of it to begin with. And take a look at total 2, which includes Ethereum. Okay, so slightly different, but this one includes Ethereum. What do you notice? A high, a lower high. This was a lower high, a lower high. Is this going to be just a lower high, or will it break out? If Bitcoin USD's rally falls before it breaks out, then this could easily come back in down here and then break to the downside. Okay, so this is the risk that I think you have to consider. But Bitcoin, could come back in and has potentially the luxury of bouncing off this trend line because it's already broken out of it, which the altcoin market has arguably not. So the altcoin market is showing relative weakness, all right? Now, one thing I want to cover really quick while I'm thinking about it is this dominance rally. Now, ideally, I would like to see the dominance take out 49% this week. That would be ideal, okay? And it could do it if we see anything close to what we saw this week. But we should also be aware that this has sort of been like some steps. So the Bitcoin dominance climbs and then it consolidates, and then it climbs and then it consolidates. So is it going to consolidate again before making a final move to break through it, or will it just go ahead and break through it now? Now, one thing to consider here, if it consolidates, then one way to visualize a potential consolidation on the Bitcoin dominance is the altcoin market still bleeding back to Bitcoin, but perhaps Ethereum shows some renewed strength for a while. Now, my base case for Ethereum Bitcoin is that it's going to break down. So this is my base case, is that Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation is going to break down. That's my opinion. It could be wrong. With that said, you can also see that it hasn't really been broken off its support like some of the altcoins that we're going to look at. So until it breaks, it might be premature to celebrate, Bitcoin breaking ETH off its support. In fact, it was back in March of 2022 that Ether Bitcoin rallied off of this level back up to around 0.0767 before it finally plunged. Now, we do know that we have the Shanghai hard fork coming up, so I suppose there could be some hype around that. And if that's the case, it could lead to the further consolidation of Bitcoin dominance for a few more weeks. But if that doesn't transpire and Bitcoin USD just continues moving higher here in the short term, then it could just kick Ether off its Bitcoin pair, the support level anyways, and then there's just simply nowhere to hide. So the point is that if Ether Bitcoin falls off of this prior support level, within the next few weeks, whether it's next week or whether it happens in, say, May, like it did in 2022, the point is that whenever Bitcoin USD comes back down, whether it's, in a couple months or whether it's next week, that Ether Bitcoin simply has nowhere to hide. Okay, so that's the argument, whether it breaks down now or if it comes back up and then breaks down, is that Ether Bitcoin has nowhere to hide. And that's the way when Bitcoin dominance sort of breaks, if it can break above 49%, then that's the way that you can see the dominance continue higher even after Bitcoin USD comes back down. So it comes back down to earth, the Bitcoin dominance could continue much higher as the altcoin market bleeds back to Bitcoin. Now, on any given day, the altcoin market doesn't have to bleed back to Bitcoin. And if you follow some of the altcoins, you'll see that ADA Bitcoin has this ability to sort of pop back up for a few weeks, to get you excited, but it just eventually leads to new lows. Okay. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is that ADA Bitcoin has already fallen off its support level. Okay. So Bitcoin's pump already has broken the ADA Bitcoin support level, right? That's why we're calling it breaking alts. It's broken the support. So whenever Bitcoin USD goes back down, the argument is that ADA Bitcoin has nowhere to hide. The prior support level of 1,500 Satoshis is no longer support, and it's just in free fall. Not that dissimilar from what happened in 2019. Now, if you want to compare the dominance rally to 2019 as opposed to 2018, take a look if you overlay Bitcoin USD. What you'll notice by overlaying Bitcoin USD here is that the rally by Bitcoin ended on sort of the second or third breakdown candle, right? So if we zoom in here, Bitcoin USD topped here in that first week over here of July or so, and then it had sort of a double top in August. But what you'll notice is that ADA Bitcoin continued going down. So it was the third breakdown candle, arguably. So this first, and what I mean by that is just large devaluations in the short term on its ADA Bitcoin pair. So essentially doing nothing for a while, and then 13% down, and then 15% down, and then this one was about an 8% drop. So it was that third week. So if that were to occur, it would mean, if this is the first one, then it would mean in like the next couple of weeks or so, right? That's what it would ultimately mean. Now, if this plays out like it did last cycle, then ADA Bitcoin coming back into its prior support level of 400 to 500 Satoshis could still represent about a 68% drop. Maybe you make the case that it's in a slight uptrend and it goes to 800 sats, but it's hard to imagine that it can't just eventually fall back down to these prior support levels. Bitcoin is a very similar thing, right? Even coming back down to this level, it's still another 25% moves to the downside. Solana Bitcoin continues to push lower. We've seen prior support become resistance a couple of times already. And it's one of those things where, people say oftentimes that, well, the Bitcoin dominance hasn't really been going up for a long time because, again, you look at it, including stablecoins, and it put in a new low as recently as September of 2022, but it sort of completely ignores the fact that this metric includes the stablecoin market. And for the most part, most of these altcoins have been devalued on their Bitcoin pairs. ADA Bitcoin, Bitcoin, Link Bitcoin has been getting significantly devalued here on its Bitcoin pair. Uni Bitcoin is falling again. Litecoin Bitcoin has been falling. Maker Bitcoin is down 40% in 5 days. And even some of the ones that have been holding up relatively well for a while, like BNB Bitcoin, is dropping quickly. Aave Bitcoin is dropping, and so on and so forth, right? Even Matic Bitcoin, which was holding for a while, is down 15% this week. AVAX Bitcoin is potentially breaking below support as well. So you have to consider that a lot of these altcoins are just simply, they're simply breaking down. Now, the argument is, well, if you had decided to, DCA a certain cryptocurrency, again, what did I say back over here in February 2022, right? I said cash is king, alt to risky. Now, early this year, we said that there's going to be some phases this year where Bitcoin can outperform, right? Where it's not going to be nearly as obvious because that's what you normally see in a recovery year. And we even showed sort of this average year-to-date ROI. So if you look at the 2015 and 2019 ROI of Bitcoin as a function of time, you get, and you take the average of it, you get something that looks like this. And it sort of shows that the downside potential is negative 25% from the yearly open, which would be down to around 12,000 Bitcoin. And the move to the upside could be as much as 2.1x from the yearly open, which would be just north of $30,000. Again, I'm not saying it has to go to either of those extremes. I'm just saying, the average of the 2014 and 2018 bear market did a pretty good job of sort of encapsulating what happened in 2022. So, and the ranges of 2022. So why not assume that you could see something very similar in 2023? So when you think about all that, it has to make you wonder, well, if the altcoin market is bleeding, at least when I consider it, I'm like, well, why would I put money in the altcoin market if I think the dominance is going to go up either way? Remember, a lot of people think that the dominance only goes up when Bitcoin USD goes up, or they think it only goes up when Bitcoin USD goes down. But the history shows us that the Bitcoin dominance can go up whether Bitcoin USD is going up or down. And there's this common misconception that just because Bitcoin goes parabolic does not always mean that altcoins will go parabolic. While they did in 2017 and 2021, there was a time in 2018 where they didn't. There was a time in 2019 where they didn't. So it might be a false assumption. It doesn't mean that altcoins can't slowly be lifted higher on their USD pairs, which is, again, Bitcoin can, sort of raise the level on altcoins overall, as you've seen occur with, say, like Ethereum and some of the other altcoins, which I don't really consider ETH and alt, but some of these altcoins have been slowly moving higher on their USD pairs. It doesn't mean that they're not bleeding back to Bitcoin. Litecoin's a good example of a coin that can often do well in its halving year. And you might say, well, look at this. I mean, it was a very similar move, and I even talked about this some before. In 2019, it sort of rallied up to $100 and then came back to 60. Did the same thing over here. And is it going to rally on up to higher levels? I don't really know. But historically, you'll see Litecoin, do better during its halving years with respect to the altcoin market. But the point is, over the macro scale, if you're a more macro investor and you take a look at the Litecoin Bitcoin valuation, the point is, who cares, right? Like, so what if it occasionally has rallies against Bitcoin? The reality of the situation is that it's just simply in a macro downtrend against Bitcoin. And from 2013, it's down 94%. I mean, even from, even if you take it back to, say, 2018, right? Like the Bitcoin USD bottom in 2018, Litecoin Bitcoin is down 57%. Okay, so the point is, who cares, right? Like Litecoin USD can certainly do well at certain phases, and there are certain people, of course, that want to take advantage of these moves, and I'm not saying they shouldn't, but the point is, Litecoin rallied, 1,500% last cycle, but for every dollar you put into Litecoin, you didn't put it into Ethereum, right? Or you didn't put it into Bitcoin. And for reference, to take a look to see what Ethereum did last cycle, it moved up from this bottom over here in March. It moved up 5,200%, right? I spent the last year arguing that Ethereum needs to ultimately come back into its lower logarithmic regression trend line down here. And of course, so far we have eluded that. But the reality is that, I was bullish on Ethereum before a 5,000% move. And now everyone gets up in arms when it just pumps back up to this, when it's basically just stuck in this range for basically the last year. So yes, I can understand why it might be frustrating, but there's a big difference between just sort of being in a range and a 5,000% move to the upside. So the point when considering the altcoin market, especially at phases like we're in right now, is that they're likely just going to continue to be devalued on their Bitcoin pairs. One of the ways to sort of visualize this in a more mathematically sound approach is to perhaps go look at something, again, I've made videos on this before, but modern portfolio theory. If you look at things like the Sharpe ratio and Sortino ratio with Bitcoin and ETH, you can see that it's about 65% Bitcoin and 35% ETH to maximize your Sortino ratio, which again does not punish positive volatility. For the Sharpe ratio, which does, it's 67% Bitcoin, 33% ETH. But look what happens if you add a couple of altcoins like XRP and Litecoin. What percentages maximize your risk-adjusted returns then? It's really low percentages of the altcoins. Really low percentages. Why? Because yes, they can give you good returns sometimes, but in bear markets, they can get absolutely crushed. And so maximizing your risk-adjusted returns would still call for relatively low percentages in the altcoin market, especially in phases like we're in right now, because they can just get simply devalued on their Bitcoin pairs. Take a look at ADA Bitcoin closer here. From the peak, it's down 80%. So ADA Bitcoin is down 80%, but it's down against an asset that also went down 77%. That's how bad ADA has gotten wrecked. Think about Solana, right? Solana has gone down against Bitcoin from the peak 82%, but Bitcoin went down itself 77%. So Solana went down 83% or so, 83% against an asset that also went down 77%. That's how bad the altcoin market can get wrecked during the altcoin reckoning. Now, anytime we make these videos, inevitably we eventually get a pump, right? Like we had over here, like we had over here, and like we had over here. But it doesn't mean the eventual resolution was not to the downside. And this is how the altcoin reckoning gets you. It pumps up. The altcoin market pumps up. It sucks in liquidity. It traps people, and then it goes lower. And it just goes on and on and on. So that's, I think, what you have to, to be on the lookout for. There's another indicator that I want to talk about very briefly. And this is the if you look at the stablecoin supply ratio, if you look at the Bollinger Bands, you can see that we've been at the top of it for a while. There's been a couple other times in recent history where this occurred. One of them was back over here. But you can see once it spends some time up here, it means we're getting into sort of like a final distribution phase before coming back in for a while. Look at it back over here in 2019. It was up in this region, and it ultimately came back in. Now, that doesn't mean it can't push higher in the short term. If you look at the current supply stablecoin supply ratio oscillator, which again gives you an idea of it quantifies, its motivation is to quantify the extent of stablecoin buying power and its estimate of its potential move price of Bitcoin. It's at the same level it was in 2019 at 2019's stablecoin supply ratio oscillator peak. Did that correspond to Bitcoin USD peak? No, Bitcoin USD had one more rally left in it before it entered into a 9-month downtrend. Did it mark the peak over here in 2021? No, it had one more rally left in it, and then it entered into a several-month downtrend before having a double peak and then going much lower. When I look at this, it is looking a little bit different than it did over here, because you can see it kind of popped up for a little bit, and rather than here it popped up and then just trended down. Here it just kind of came up to this level and then trended down. This one's actually putting in a higher high, so I don't know if that means that Bitcoin USD is going to get one more push higher or not. But if it does, then ideally, if it does, we would see the Bitcoin dominance break through 49%. So to get to closer to that 50% level. And if it does, then I think what's happened is it's broken the altcoin market. Many of them have already fallen. ADA Bitcoin's fallen, Solana Bitcoin's fallen, Dot Bitcoin has fallen, and so on and so forth. What hasn't fallen is Ether Bitcoin, right? That one has not yet fallen, and I don't know if it's going to get one more push up or not. I personally hope it doesn't. I hope it just comes down right now, and we sort of get into that final stage of the altcoin reckoning. Now, you might say, well, why be so pessimistic about the altcoin market? Well, I suppose it has something to do with getting burned so many times in it. I even warned people back in Q3 of 2022 that people getting into the altcoin market are likely to get wrecked by the end of the year when Bitcoin theoretically capitulates, just because I've experienced it many times myself. And we can see that a lot of altcoins continue to push lower, not only in November, but also December as well. So that's something I think you have to keep in mind, is that these altcoins can continue lower in either event, which is it's sort of like a sobering reality to consider. But the point is, if Bitcoin can push high enough, quickly enough, the assumption that altcoins can rally can somewhat be misplaced if they're frankly getting rejected by the same levels that Bitcoin was able to rally through. So I think when you go back to things like Total 3, you have to consider, can Total 3 break out of this, or is it just going to play out in the same way that it played out over here, where you get sort of like a false breakout or maybe like a double top or something, and then it sees a 60% capitulation to the downside. Is Total 2, which includes Ethereum, is it going to break out, or is it ultimately just going to come back in? Again, the USD valuations can go slightly higher if Bitcoin USD can continue on up, but if Bitcoin continues on up, then that means the dominance could very well likely break through this threshold and ultimately break the altcoin market. Now, one of the other reason I would like to see this occur is not just because I've seen altcoins get wrecked in the past, but it's also because true generational opportunities don't really present themselves that frequently. And the hard part about generational opportunities in the altcoin market is just simply waiting for them. It's easy to want to sort of get a head start, and everyone wants to get in as quickly as they can, but it's very difficult just being patient and waiting. That's the hardest part to it. I mean, if it were easy, then generational opportunities would come around much more frequently, but that's just simply not the case. So the other reason I want to see it is because if you do have some cash that you could deploy into the market under that scenario, then it can actually lead to to outsized gains in a theoretical future bull market under better economic conditions. So I think that's ultimately the argument that I'm trying to put forth. Okay, so we've covered a lot, but the ultimate idea here is that if Bitcoin dominance can break above 49%, then the argument is that it's breaking the altcoin market, and that when Bitcoin USD comes back down, the Bitcoin dominance can continue to go higher, leading to the further devaluation of altcoins, not only on their USD pairs, but also on their Bitcoin pairs. And history shows us that a lot of these altcoins still have likely much further to fall just to get back to being what a more optimistic scenario would just simply be something like an oscillator against Bitcoin, which frankly for most altcoins would be the optimistic scenario over a longer period of time. And that is ultimately, I think, the important consideration to make when considering the altcoin market, is that many of them do just simply continue to bleed against Bitcoin over the macro scale. So if you're going to take the risk on the altcoin market, it makes more sense to get a better understanding or a better feeling that the altcoin market has not only bottomed on its USD valuation, but also on its Bitcoin valuation as well. Because for every dollar you put in an altcoin, it's a dollar you're not putting in a Bitcoin, which is more so stood the test of time. And also it's a dollar that you're risking, right? You're risking it on something, and you want to make sure that whatever you're risking it on is ultimately worth it, right? You want to make sure the theoretical reward is worth the risk that you are ultimately taking. So the thing to look for is things like the stablecoin supply ratio. Does it start to come back down quickly? If it does, that could signal that Bitcoin USD is starting to show signs of weakness. And in that case, if Bitcoin dominance is broken through that level, then it might mean that the altcoin market isn't really going to continue rallying. I think you also have to look at, you can take a look at the year-to-date ROI that we looked at with regards to sort of the average of 2015 and 2019 and related to 2023. You can take a look at the Bitcoin dominance, including stable coins, to see if it can break above this level. You could also compare it to 2019 as well, but in either case, dominance went higher once Bitcoin corrected. You can take a look at the Bitcoin dominance not including stable coins, which is continuing to break higher and is currently sitting at 52%, which is a pretty high level considering where we were just a few months ago. So the altcoin reckoning is something that takes place normally over 18 to 24 months. And it's already been going on for at least 15 to 16 months or so. And it's likely going to continue on, I would argue, for another 4 to 6 months potentially before it's finally over and the altcoin market is finally capitulated out everything that it's going to, and then it can slowly start to trend higher again. But until then, I do think people should be somewhat wary of the altcoin market and tread very carefully. Okay, I'm not going to say that they can't go up on their USD pairs. They can. But on their Bitcoin pairs, you are likely going to continue to see them bleed for several months to come. And that's ultimately the point. The last thing I will remind people of is with regards to Bitcoin USD, one of the things I've mentioned many, many times, and it's one of the things I talk about quite frequently on the premium side, again, into the Cryptoverse.com, is that you have these risk levels for Bitcoin. The whole idea is you just sort of DCA into Bitcoin at low risk levels and DCA out at high risk levels. It's not about timing the bottom exactly. It's just about getting into the market slowly, getting out of the market slowly. It has nothing to do with timing the bottom, because no one is going to identically time the bottom. No one's going to identically time the top. Where DCAing is not nearly as attractive is for the altcoin market. And that's why I said more than a year ago that alts are too risky. Right? Because a lot of them, the reality is a lot of them will not ever see a new all-time high again. Okay, just because you DCA in an altcoin and get your cost basis down and down and down doesn't mean it's ever going to go see a new all-time high. You think back to last cycle, there are plenty of coins that did not go to new highs from where they were back in 2017, just like there were in 2017 coins that made highs in 2013 that were not repeated. So the idea that every single coin that you're DCAing into is going to see a new all-time high is likely not true. One of the reasons for that is when liquidity dries up, when you get into bear markets and recessions, a lot of teams just throw in the towel. They don't care about it anymore, and they'll move on to something else. And that's just when you don't really want to risk your own money on the altcoin market. but to see which ones can actually stick around. If you see certain altcoins that are actually providing real world utility, which is arguably going to be a more important part of the world we're moving into with higher interest rates, then I think you could make the case that that altcoin could see a new all-time high. And there were several altcoins that did see new all-time highs last cycle, and we talked about them on the channel, in fact. But a lot of altcoins won't see new all-time highs, and that's the reason why Bitcoin heavy portfolios can tend to perform much better during this phase, because at the end of the day, if you are just heavy Bitcoin and your crypto portfolio has been heavy Bitcoin for the last year, even throughout the entire bear market, you reserve the right to potentially convert those to altcoins when you want, and get much better valuations, because most of these altcoins are down 80, 85, 90% against Bitcoin. So you can get a lot of the altcoins just with the Bitcoin that you had, right? That's what you have to consider. Navigating the cryptoverse is much better done by valuing altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs, not their USD pairs. It's much better done on their Bitcoin pairs and maybe their Ether pairs, but definitely on their Bitcoin pairs. And once once you get to that point of thinking about these things, a lot of these coins, I don't even know what their USD valuations are. I just kind of look at their Bitcoin valuations. Once you get to seeing, sort of how they're valued on their Bitcoin pairs, then I think things like the dominance of Bitcoin make a lot more sense to to sort of focus on, right? I think it brings into the light why the dominance is so important. And my opinion is that understanding the Bitcoin dominance is truly the secret, the key to unlocking the secret of the cryptoverse. And when you can figure out, like, okay, when you're down here, it makes more sense to be Bitcoin heavy in sort of anticipation of the dominance going higher. And when you're up here, it makes sense to be more, to be at least more exposed to the altcoin market. I would still argue heavier in Bitcoin just because you don't know which altcoins are going to take off, but maybe heavier in altcoins than you would be over here, because eventually the dominance is likely going to break back down. So that is the ultimate message that I'm trying to sort of convey through these types of videos, where I just hammer on and on and on about the Bitcoin dominance, is that I truly do think it is the secret to unlocking this, the cryptoverse, or it's the key to unlocking the secret of the cryptoverse, and then figuring out when does it make sense to be heavy into the altcoin market and when does it not. And given the idea of the devaluation of altcoins that we're seeing on their Bitcoin pairs, I still think that altcoins are simply too soon at this phase. I think many of them will continue lower on their USD pairs, and I think the fact that Bitcoin USD has broken out and the altcoin market has not tells you quite a bit as to the relative weakness of the altcoin market. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe. Again, we do have Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. And we have the sale going on right now as well, so make sure you check that out. We have several different tiers available. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.